Today we're going to learn Pesachim Daf Yud Daled. We are starting a new section. This is the Daf for Shabbat. We're starting a whole new section on laws of purity and impurity. We'll talk in a minute about how we got to this. Today's Daf is sponsored by Shiur Peleg in honor of Ariel Peleg. Congratulations on matching with one of your top hematology, medical oncology fellowship programs. And thank you for introducing me to Hadran and encouraging me to learn. We're going to start with the Mishnah. Rabbi Chanina Sgan HaKohanim Omer. Mimehen shel Kohanim lo nimneu, from the times of the Kohanim, meaning back from those times, lo nimneu milisrof et habasar shenitma bevlad hatuma im habasar shenitma b'av hatuma. Okay, this is a big mouthful. We're going to stop and take a break for a minute. So now what he's basically saying is, in the time of the Kohanim, they didn't refrain from burning some types of impure items with other types of impure items. And we're going to see, I'll just read one more line, even though theoretically you're making one of them become more impure. So the question is going to be right now, first we're going to have to understand some background about laws of purity and impurity, and therefore understand why some of these things are impure in one way and might become more impure by burning them together with the truma. So to begin to understand this, first I want to look at some laws of purity and impurity and some background issues. So if we look, and I'm going to pull up a chart in a second. If we look at, and you can look at the chart if you're not watching this, you can look at the chart on the sheet that'll be up on the site. We have different levels of tuma. Okay, this is basics. We've learned this. We learned it in Shabbat Yud Daled. By the way, we're in Pesachim Yud Daled. Interesting coincidence, and it comes up all sorts of other times. So if you look, there's different levels of tuma. There's avi avot tuma, which is the highest level of tuma. That's usually like a dead body. Okay, that's the most tameh thing you can get. It can pass on impurity to people and kelim, items, but not food and drink. And so here's our example, a goof of a maid, of dead body. Avatuma would be, number one, it could be someone who became impure from coming in contact with a dead body. It could be a nida, a yoledet, someone who gives birth, right? A woman who's menstruating, someone who gives birth. A zav or a zavas, someone who has a discharge. For the woman, it's a bloody discharge. Nivela, a dead animal that died on its own. Sheretz from the Shmona Shvatzim. Any of these things are considered avatuma. They pass on impurity to people and kelim, vessels, and also to food and drink. Now, every level, what's important to always understand, whatever level you're in, you pass on impurity at the next level. So if an avi avot tuma touches a person, the person becomes an avatuma. If an avatuma touches something else, like a person or items or food or drink, they become a rishon. So a rishon is basically, as we just said, anything that became impure based on the avatuma. And that can create impurity, sheni latuma, which sheni can only be food and drink. Okay, at this point, a rishon can only be mitame food and drink, and therefore sheni is always going to be only food and drink, and it's food and drinks that were tame from a rishon. Then we have, dropping down another level, a sheni can only pass on impurity to food and drinks that are truma or kudshim. If you're dealing with chulin, things that are not sanctified, that's the end game. Sheni is as far as you can go. But if you touch food and drink, and this is what we're going to see, it's called, they're poselet hatruma, they disqualify truma because that's the end game for truma. But for revi l'truma, you can pass on even kodshim, for sanctified meat. So anything that's sanctified, temple sanctity, those can become disqualified by a shlishi, and then they become what we call their posel. The revi of them can't pass on impurity anymore, so that's the end game. So let's look at Rabbi Chanina Sgan HaKohanim, and here I charted out what he says. So in the times of the Kohanim, they didn't stop themselves from putting together the following two things. And now it's going to be a little bit tricky what exactly this first case is. A basar shenitma, meat that became impure from a vlad hatuma. A vlad hatuma is either a rishon or a sheni. Okay, really it sounds like it's a rishon. We're going to have some issues with it, and later the Gemara is going to say we must be dealing with a shlishi. But right now, normally we say vlad hatuma, we mean a rishon. It means something that became tameh from something else, which normally, other than tumat made, is going to be an avatuma, which then makes them a rishon. If you have meat now that was disqualified, that was impurified, or became, sorry, that's not a word, became impure from a rishon, it becomes a sheni. So we have meat that's either a sheni, or maybe we're going to see later that it's a shlishi, but at this point it kind of sounds like it's a sheni. And you put that together with basar shenitma from an avatuma, which would be a rishon. So basically what he says is, since you have meat that's a sheni and you have meat that's a rishon, we don't have an issue with you burning these things together, even though alpha pisha mosifim al tumato. What does that mean? Well, what's going to happen when you put the rishon together with the sheni? The rishon creates a sheni also. So and this is going to be the problem with saying it's a sheni. It actually doesn't make it any worse than it was before. It was already a sheni. So when it comes in contact with the rishon, it's going to become a sheni. But what it seems to be saying, which we're going to eventually say in the Gemara, is this must be the vladatum is a sheni, the basar shenisma is a shlishi. And what we're saying is there's no problem that we're taking this meat, it's obviously kochim, it's sanctified meat, or truma meat, and we're basically, well, it wouldn't really be truma, but it would be sanctified meat. We're basically going to say this meat is now, the sanctified meat from a sacrifice is now going to move up from a shlishi to a sheni. Now, and there, we don't have an issue with that, even though you're making it worse, it's okay. Why is it okay? Or why wouldn't it be okay in the first place? The reason it wouldn't be okay in the first place is because what? Because you're not allowed to disqualify meat that's sanctified, or truma for all intents and purposes. We can't disqualify it. So you might have thought to take something that's already impure and make it a higher level of impurity maybe is also a problem. He comes and says, really, that's not a problem. It doesn't bother us. Okay, so that's what we have so far in the Mishnah. We're now going to go back to the next line of our Mishnah. So reading on from the Mishnah right now. Husif Rabbi Akiba v'amal. So Rabbi Akiba now added. He adds, now this is going to be a bit of a problem because it doesn't sound like he's adding anything. We're going to see, but he adds the following. The Gemara is going to deal with that. Mimehem shel kohanim lo nimneu milahadlik et hashemen shenifsal b'tvul yom b'ner shenitma b'tamei met. Alfa pi shemosifim tuma al tumato. Now I know it probably sounds to you like a little bit of gibberish, what exactly we're talking about, but have no fear. By the end of today, you will understand this. Okay, so let's go back now to our chart. So again, Rabbi Akiva says the Kohanim did not deter themselves. They didn't stop from doing the following, mixing the following two things and burning them together. What were they? So we have shemen, oil, that became disqualified. Now remember what I told you. If something's a sheni and it comes in contact with a shlishi, and a shlishi is truma, now we're talking about oil that was truma. That's gifts that they gave to the Kohanim, which had sanctity to them. If it was already disqualified, why was it disqualified? Because it came in contact with a tvul yom. A tvul yom is someone who's supposed to go to the mikveh that day. They go in the morning, but they have to wait till the sun sets until they become fully pure. During that day, it doesn't matter why they were impure to begin with. During that day, their status is that they have status of a sheni. Normally, a sheni isn't a person. In this case, they have a status of a sheni. Why is that? They're in between. They've gone to the mikveh already, but the Torah says you have to wait till the sun sets till you're fully pure. So they're a little bit impure. So they can only mess up truma. So if a tvul yom came in contact with this oil, it became a shlishi. That is allowed to be burned with a tamei met, which is someone who came in contact with a dead person, who's an avatuma. That caused impurity, right? Came in contact with a ner shenitma, with a candle, or really we mean, right, the vessel in which they put the oil was a rishon. So you can basically burn this shlishi l'tuma together with a rishon, even though theoretically you're mosifim tumal tumato. Why? Because the shemen is now going to become a sheni. And like I said, you're not allowed to disqualify truma intentionally. And yet here you're taking something that was already disqualified and you're just turning it into a higher level of tuma, but we're still going to say that that's allowed. So it sounds kind of like they're saying the same thing, and the Gemara is going to have to figure out what's actually different about what they're saying. Okay, so we'll get to that. Moving on in the Mishnah now. So the Mishnah now continues and says, Rabbi Meir, we have Rabbi Meir's opinion. Midivrehen lamanu, from what they say, we've learned, shesorfim truma tehora im hatmea bepesach, that we burn pure truma with impure truma on Pesach. Oh, all of a sudden, now we realize, why on earth are we getting into this? If you remember, this has to do with the previous Mishnah. What did we see in the previous Mishnah? If you remember, we had at the end of that Mishnah, Rabban Gamliel's opinion. What was Rabban Gamliel's opinion? Rabban Gamliel said, Chulin nechalim kol arba. You can eat chulin all the 4th hour. Truma kol chamesh. Truma, though, you have an extra hour so that we don't end up burning leftover truma that you have before Pesach. We don't want to burn truma if we don't have to. So once they're talking about burning truma, so now they make reference, comes Rashi, and he says, Mimehem shel kohanim, hachanakat la, we're on the 2nd line of Rashi on the page, Seifa de katani midivrehen lamanu shesorfim truma. It's because of this line that this is in the Mishnah here. Because what he's saying is, from what they say, and this is going to be a big question of the Gemara, from what who says, because what does this have to do with anything? How do we learn from the first 2 cases, which sounds like it's referring to, that we burn truma tahora with tme'ah? What's the issue? Well, the issue is that in our Mishnah, we said we can burn something that's disqualified with something else that's disqualified, even though they're on different levels. This comes to tell you from here, you can learn that you can burn pure truma with impure truma on Pesach. What does this mean? So first of all, where did they learn it from is going to be a question. But in essence, what it means is when you're burning your chametz, since you're burning your chametz anyway, you can put together pure truma and impure truma, even though theoretically you're going to mess up that truma. Since you're burning it anyway, it's okay, which is probably also the reason with all the first cases. Since you're going to burn it anyway, it really doesn't matter that you're putting them together and disqualifying it worse than it was before because it's going to be burned. Okay, so in that sense, the logic is the same. However, the cases are very different. To burn something that's totally pure with something impure, you can't necessarily learn that from something that was already impure with something at a different level of impurity, right? That's going to make it a higher level of impurity. That's different than actually something pure and impure. So again, all these lines of the Gemara, of the Mishnah, we're going to have to explain better when we get to the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Yossi, eina hi amida. This is not true. What you said that you can learn from here that we burn truma tahora with truma tameh, it's just not true. Umodim Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua. Okay, all of a sudden we're bringing in 2 other opinions. Where do they come from? We don't know. They seem to disagree about something, but they agree. Shesorfin zolatzma v'zolatzma. In other words, he's not saying I disagree with you that midivrehem lamadnu. I disagree with you that you can even do this. Forget about whether we learned it or not from there. But it's not true. You can't burn truma you can't burn pure truma with impure truma on Erev Pesach. They all agree that sorfim zolatzma v'zona atzma. Amanech leku. In which case were they disagreeing? Al hatzluya v'al hatmea. If you have truma tzluya, what does that mean? It means it's hanging. Okay, what does this mean? This is a case of truma midirabanan. There's certain cases where something will be considered where it's where it's disqualified midirabanan. Truma is possible. The truma is truma. But maybe it was disqualified, but we're not sure, or some sort of suffix about it where we're not sure what to do. Now, I told you from the beginning that we don't want to be burning truma if we don't have to. Truma has sanctity. You don't burn something with sanctity unless it's disqualified. Then when it gets disqualified, you have to burn it. What if you get into this sticky situation? You have a situation where you're not sure if it got impure or not. If it really is impure, you have to burn it. If it's not impure, you can't burn it. So you're stuck in the middle. So what do? Tolim, we leave it. We kind of can't eat it, but we also don't burn it. So we leave it in the middle. So that's like a suffix truma, or truma derabanan, you could call it, right? Any kind of truma that's psulami derabanan. It's disqualified on a derabanan level, on a rabbinic level, not on a Torah level. Because only from a Torah level do you burn it. If it's only rabbinic in nature, then we're not going to allow you to burn it based on that. So if you have something that's tluya and you have something that's tme'ah, then in that case, they have an argument. You still can't burn them together on Erev Pesach. And Rabbi Yeshua says, no, that actually, since it already is disqualified, midrabanan will allow you to burn them together. Okay, so like I said, many different parts of this Mishnah. We're going to go one by one. We're not going to finish this all today. We're only going to get started. So the Gemara starts off and says, okay, I'm going to pull up the charts again because I think they'll be helpful. Okay, let's pull it up. Okay, so let's look at what we said here. Michti basar shenitma bevlada tuma mai have. A basar that becomes disqualified from a vlada tuma. A vlada is usually a rishon. So mai have, it'll be a sheni because anything that gets disqualified from something else drops down a level. So that's a sheni. Ki saref le bahade basal shenitma ba'avatuma ma'have. Sheni, right? What's it going to become? A sheni. If you mix this together, this meat, which is a sheni, now gets together with this meat, that's a rishon, because it got disqualified by an avhatuma, right? And then it got disqualified, became a rishon. So what's when these two go together, we have a rishon and a sheni. The rishon is going to mess up the sheni and cause it to become a sheni. So sheni v'shenihu, my mosiflo tumal tumato ika. There is no added tuma. What are we talking about? So what if it becomes a sheni? It already was a sheni. So Amar Rav Yehuda, hacha bevlad vlad askinan. We must be talking about it's not a vlad tuma. So this is not, right? Because I'm doing this in actuality, I can erase it. This is not a case of, sorry, I erased the wrong thing. This is not the case of a rishon. This is actually a sheni, right? This becomes, the vlad tuma is a sheni. The basar that becomes nitma is a shlishi. And now we have, right, dehavele shlishi v'kasavar, and now we have, it's a shlishi. You can mix it with a rishon, even though it's going to become a sheni. And that's what Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim is coming to say. V'kasavar shlishi mutar lasato sheni. Okay, that's what it teaches you. Veha, but wait a minute. Ein ocha mitame ocha. But we have a separate problem here. We know that food cannot create impurities for other foods. Now, this is a little strange because I did tell you that certain things in that original chart, that certain things that could be food can be mitame other foods, like food could become a rishon and then it can be mitame a sheni. So now we're going to see that this is a subject of debate. So they say, but ochel, food can't be mitame other food. How do we know this? Tanya, it says in a bright. Yachol yehe ochel mitame ochel. You might have thought that food can disqualify other food, make it impure. Talmud Lomar, but we learn this all out from the verses that talk about susceptibility to impurity. Ki yutan mayim al zera v'nafal minivlatam alav. First, water has to get on it, remember? Then something becomes susceptible to impurity. And then it says, and a nevela fell upon it. So if a nevela falls upon it, a nevela is an avatuma, it makes it tameh. So they say tamehu in the pasuk. So what do they learn from the words tamehu? Hu tameh, ve'eno sekayotze bo tameh. It itself becomes tameh, but it can't transfer impurity to anything else. So according to this drasha, food does not mitame other food. So we're now going to have a few possible answers to this question. The first is, Hani chala Abaye. It works very well to Abaye. Why? Because Abaye says, Lo shanu ela b'chulin. The fact that food can contaminate other food or make it impure, that's because it's only a reference to chulin. That pasuk was talking about regular crops. It wasn't talking about sanctified items, not truma, not kodshim, sacrificial meat. So it's only true for chulin. Aval b'truma v'kodshim oseh kayotze bo. But when it comes to truma, which is the topic of Rabbi Akiba, and it comes to kodshim, which was the topic of Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim, it can create. Okay, just like they go an extra level. There's shlishi for truma and kodshim, and there's revi'i for kodshim. So likewise here, food can't pass on impurity to other food, but it can pass it on to truma and kodshim. Okay, not just to chulin. Ula Rav Ada bar Ava, Mishmei de Rava. Now he said, Nami, you can also answer according to him. Why? Da'amal lo shanu ela chulin u'truma. He said only chulin and truma is a problem. Aval, it can't pass on impurity, not to chulin. He's basically adding truma to the list. Aval b'kodshim oseh kayotze bahen. So then, Shapir, according to him, it can pass on, ochel can pass on impurity to food that's chulin or even truma. But Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim was talking about sacrificial meat, and it can't pass it on to sacrificial meat. So according to both of them, we have a very good answer. But Ela Ravina, but there's a third opinion here, Mishmei de Rava. He explained that Rava said, okay, Rav Ada thought that Rava said, chulin and truma, no, kodshim, yes. But Ravina said in the name of Rava, Damal, Mikrama le diber katuv. The pasuk was talking in general. In general means it applies across the board. Loshna chulin, loshna truma, loshna kodshim. Eno sekayotze. Food can never pass on impurity to other food. In which case, according to him, we're stuck. We have no way of explaining Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim. So ma'i kalamemar. So what can we answer? So he answers the following thing. He says, Hacha b'mayaskinan, di'ika mashkin bahade basal, dekamatame machma mashkin. There must be some sort of liquid on the meat Now, there's a whole special rule by liquids. Okay, this is a whole topic in and of itself called tumat mashkin. There's a special law about mashkin that if a liquid comes in contact with a food, then let's say the food, whatever it is, that's going to create a situation where whatever it comes in contact with is now going to be a sheni. Like the mash can make it a rishon, and whatever it touches is now going to be a sheni. So it kind of rejuvenates the tuma. Okay, we're not going to get into why this is. Maybe we'll discuss that. Or we'll definitely discuss it at another point. Okay, but right now let's accept that as a given. So according to him, he says like this: if there was liquid, let's say there was gravy on that piece of meat with the meat, then it's mitame machma mashkin. Okay, then you're going to end up with tuma mashkin here. Okay, so that's going to create a situation where now, right, we started with, our whole question was, ochel can't be mitame ochel. It can be, though, if it comes in contact with the liquid. Okay, and that's why it's going to make it a sheni, and that was exactly our issue. That because it has the liquid, and now it touches that other food, it's going to make it into a sheni. Okay, so we had three possible answers. Now we're going to ask a question on this third answer. But wait, it doesn't match the words of the Mishnah. It said you're allowed to burn it with the meat that was disqualified, that was impure from an avatuma. That's a rishon, right? But it should say im habasar umashkin mebale. It should have said specifically liquids, because if it's not even a question if the meat didn't have any liquid on it, because then of course it wouldn't be able to pass on impurity. Food doesn't pass on impurity to food, even with kodshim. Again, this is according to Ravina's explanation. So it should have said with the meat, with liquid, because it's only the liquid that creates the problem. And then again, Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim, remember what he says. I don't care that, right? It doesn't bother us that it's going to become more impure. We still allow it to be burned. So now they say, we're going to have a fourth answer because we basically rejected the third answer. So we're going to have to give a different explanation to ones who hold that ochel is not matame ochel ever. So we're going to say, even though food can't pass on impurity to other foods, that's only on a Torah level. But on a rabbinic, and it was all darshan from the pasuk, but on a rabbinic level, the rabbi said it does become impure. And therefore, maybe we're only talking, maybe it's all going on only on a rabbinic level. And maybe that's why that would then explain why do we not care that it's adding tumah? Because that tumah is only rabbinic in nature, and therefore it's okay. Moving on now, that's what we understood so far, Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim. Now we're going to move on to Rabbi Akiba. So I'll pull up again the chart so that you see Rabbi Akiva's opinion here. Okay. Hosif Rabbi Akiva, mimehem shel kohanim, lo nimneu miladlik what? Ladlik, I'll just read it again. Shemen, which became disqualified from a tvul yom, from someone who had already gone to the mikveh. So that basically means it was a shlishi because it came in contact with a sheni. And then we want to be able to burn that, and it's okay to burn that with in a vessel that was disqualified, the vessel for holding the oil and the candle, that was not disqualified. It became impure from a tamei mate. So it was a rishon. So now we're going to say, here we have a problem. Why? We're basically saying in this case, what do we have? And you'll figure out the problem right away, which is we have a shlishi and we can burn it with a rishon, even though the rishon is going to create impurity to the shlishi and cause it to be a sheni. Now, what's the problem? Isn't that what we just said above? That Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim said you could take a rishon and burn it together with a shlishi. And that's going to be the Gemara's question, but hold off for a second. So now they're going to go through exactly what I did inside. Michti shemen shenifsal b'tvul yom mai have shlishi, right? The shemen is a shlishi. V'chimad likle bener shenitma b'tamei meit mai have. If you, here what we're actually talking about is taking the oil that became disqualified. The only thing you can do with truma once it's disqualified is burn it. What's fascinating, or I think it's interesting about, normally if it's food, you're going to burn it and it's going to go to waste. But what we're going to learn is even food that goes to waste and you burn, you can use it as to kindle something underneath. And likewise, the oil, you can use it to burn in a candle because as long as you're burning it, it's fine. It's not actually forbidden to benefit from once you burn it. So the oil that's now disqualified, you can put it into this utensil, this vessel that's a rishon, even though theoretically, as soon as you do that, you're creating a sheni. So now the Gemara says, it's going to be a sheni. My kamashmalan. So what's this teaching us? Shlishi mutar lasoto sheni. Right? It sounds like it's saying, we don't care that you're turning a shlishi into a sheni. Well, hainu hach, that's exactly what Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim said. So that doesn't make any sense. So now the Gemara says, it must be, it's a metal implement. What does that do for us? Well, there's another halacha you need to learn. Okay, instead of giving you the intro and explaining to you all these things before, I thought it was a good method to just explain them as we get there. Because if I explain them before, you might not remember when we get there what does this have to do with anything. But here you can put it in a context. So now we're going to learn this pasuk. B'chalal cherev. It says, B'chol asher im b'midbar yutet. It says, Kol asher yiga al pnei hasadeh b'chalal cherev o b'meit. If you touch in a field a dead body, okay, now what does it call a dead body? A chalal cherev, someone who was killed by a sword. So they darshan, and this is a very interesting drasha, cherev hareu kechalal. Now, I'll explain it in a few different ways, but the first way to explain it is to say that the sword that was used to kill someone has the status of a dead body. And basically, if a dead body is avi avot tum'ah, then the cherev also, okay, we're actually going to give it the status of, I think it only has a status of an avatuma. No, sorry, it's avi avot tum'ah. It's like the dead body itself. Okay, that's what Rashi says. And therefore, if it comes in contact with a person, the person becomes a tmei met. Okay, tmei met. They become a person who's an avatuma. So we give the status, okay, this has a higher status. Okay, so now, this is a unique halacha by a dead body, that the sword, okay, so now there's a debate about this, whether it's only a murder weapon that actually killed someone, or does it mean anything metal? Or some people even say it means any kind of utensil other than earthenware, okay? Anything that's made out of anything other than earthenware vessels. So now, how does this help us? Because what does he say? We're talking about a ner shel matechet. Okay, what does that do for us? If we're talking about a ner shel matechet, they say, right, b'chalal cherev, cherev hareu kechalal. If that's the case, havyale av hatuma. The candle now, if it became contaminated, right, we're going to say it itself is the avatuma, because it's an avatuma now, that ner. So now they're going to say, because it was metal, okay, you'd have to say here that it's, right, one second. Rashi says, De'enu elo rishon, kinogea b'tamemet. Vashmina Rabbi Akiba, d'shlishi mutar lasoto sheni. In other words, again, we're going to say that this is, sorry, I read the wrong Rashi. That was my mistake. Okay, so the ner is an avatuma. Okay, why it's not avi avot hatuma was my question. Hareu, no. Right, that's what happened. Sorry, I got confused by the case. Okay, so let's go back now to the case. Okay, I'll pull it up. What happened? We had a ner shenitma b'tmei met. Because it's metal, we're going to give it a higher status. If an avatuma touches it, it's going to have the same status. If a tamei met touches it, it's going to have the same status as the tamei met, and it's going to be an avatuma. So again, we can erase this and change this here. Instead of rishon latuma, it's now going to be an avatuma. Okay, now we can see where this is going. If an avatuma comes in touch with a shlishi, the shemen, the oil, is now going to be a rishon, okay? And therefore, that's the difference between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim. Chanina said, you can turn it into a sheni. Rabbi Akiva adds, and that's why it says he adds, you can even turn the oil into a rishon. Okay, that's a big difference. Okay, so now the Gemara says, Umay duchka de Rav Yehuda leukma b'ner shel matechet. Why did he have to be pushed into a corner to say it had to be a metal vessel? Why didn't he just nukma b'ner shel cheres? Why don't you just say it was talking about a regular earthenware candle? Umay hosif. Now, still, even if it's a sheni, okay, if we go back to that chart and we just erase what I just changed and change it back to the original, and it's still a sheni, it's still different. Why is it different? So again, let's look at the difference between the cases. He says, Hatam tameh v'tameh. Ve'ilu hacha pasul v'tameh. The first case of Rabbi Chanina was you have something tameh mixed with something else tameh. And he says, we don't care if you take something tameh and you mix it with something tameh, even though it makes it worse, it's fine. But look at what Rabbi Akiva's example is. It's not called shemen shenitma al yedei tful yom. They call shemen shenifsal, and it's not just a linguistic thing. Shemen shenifsal means it's disqualified, and as I said before, that's the end game. It's finished. You can't do anything with it now. So you might have thought what they're trying to say is here we're mixing pasul with tameh. Maybe you can't mix something that was disqualified with something that was tameh. And therefore, the chiddush of Rabbi Akiva is you can do that also. Okay? Facts that we're mixing a pasul and tameh. So basically, the Gemara is saying, why didn't we just simply say that? We didn't have to say it's only if you use a metal utensil. We could just simply say these are two different cases, and Rabbi Akiva is adding that to the picture. So Rava is going to now explain why we didn't want to say that. Matnitin kashite. The Mishnah was struggling. They were struggling with the language of the Mishnah. My area detani ner shenitma b'tmeimet. Why did it specifically give an example of a ner that came in contact with a tmeimet? If you wanted to say the ner is a rishon because it came in contact with an avatuma, you didn't need to use tmeimet. You could have used any other examples. Go back to our chart. We have lots of examples of avotatuma, and it could have been any one of those. It could have been nida, a yoled, a zav, a zavan, a vela, a sheretz, right? So the Gemara says, nitne shenitma b'sheretz. So why did it specifically talk about a tmeimet? It must be there's something unique to this case that only is relevant to a tmeimet. Ela ezeu davar shechalukat tumato bein tumamet l'sheretz hevei omer zo matechet. We must be talking about matechet, which would be something that would differentiate a tmeimet case from any other case. Okay, that's to understand what Rabbi Chanina said. We understood. Now we understand what Rabbi Akiva said, right? One is saying we can turn something into a sheni, and the other one saying we can turn something even into a rishon. Now comes Rava, and he says he's going to basically try to infer something from Rabbi Akiva. I'm a Rava. Shmamina, we can infer from here. Kasavar Rabbi Akiva tumat mashkin l'tamei acherim deoraita. This whole thing about tumat mashkin that I mentioned earlier, there's a debate about whether the fact that tumat mashkin, whether they have tuma in general, and the fact that they can then transfer tuma and kind of raise up the level of tuma when they come in contact with something, we can infer from here the tumat mashkin l'tamei acherim is deoraita. The fact that liquids can be mitame other things is a law by the Torah. There's a debate whether it's Torah or rabbinic. So they say you can infer from Rabbi Akiva it's Torah. Why? Because what are we talking about? Shemen. He was talking about oil. Oil is d'Rabbanan. Oil is a liquid. If you want to say it's d'Rabbanan, michti hainer makamahanya lahai shemen. What's the ner going to do to this shemen at all? Ila ifsule gufe hapasavakai. Take this oil. If the oil can't disqualify anything else, which it can't right now, right? But if we're going to say that tumat mashkin, that it has the potential to be matame other things, is only rabbinic in nature, then if we look at this purely on a doraita level, here we have truma, oil, that's disqualified, right? It's finished. And we want to say, we don't care that we make it worse. Well, you're not actually making it worse, because if it can't pass on any kind of impurity to anything else on a Torah level, then you're not actually making it worse by mixing it. And then there's no unique halacha where Rabbi Akiva is saying that we don't care that you're making it worse, because you're not actually making it worse. It's already kind of finished. There's nothing else that can be done with it. It can't get worse than that. So they say, wait, mimai, dilma l'tamei acherim midrabanan. Why are you only looking on a Torah level? You could say it can make it worse on a rabbinic level, and yet we still allow it, right? So why wouldn't you say that that's an option? So they say no, because imi d'Rabbanan my area ba'avatuma afilu b'rishon b'sheni nami tchila. If you're talking about on a rabbinic level, well, that's what I told you before, that there's two things going on. One is, can liquids disqualify other foods or drinks? And the second thing is, when liquids come in contact with, when a liquid falls on a food, it raises up the level of tuma and can be matame, like a level of a rishon. Let's say you have food that's a sheni. Liquid comes in contact with it, it becomes a rishon and is matame, whatever it comes in contact with, right? Any other food. So if that's the case, why did it need to say ba'avatuma? Afilu b'rishon v'sheni nami tchila have. It also becomes it can be mitame at a level of a rishon. If we're trying, remember we said the whole chiddush of Rabbi Akiva is that even if you make this item a rishon, it would work. It would be a problem, right? It would still, you'd still be allowed to do it. So they wouldn't have needed to bring a case of an avatuma and a rishon if it came in contact with the liquid, because the shemen's there, it would kind of raise up the level of tuma anyway. Ditznan, kol posel et truma, anything that can disqualify truma, meaning a sheni, mitame mashkin liot tchila. It disqualifies liquids that they can become a rishon, basically. So when this candle, which it didn't need to be a rishon, it could even be a sheni. If it gets touched by this oil, the oil basically becomes like a rishon and can be mitame other foods like a sheni on a rabbinic level. So therefore, if this was all rabbinic in nature, then you wouldn't even have needed to bring an avatuma case. You could have brought even lesser tuma. He would still say, even though you're going to bring up tuma, right? Even though you're going to raise up the level of this oil, because the oil is now going to become a rishon and can be mitame all sorts of things, you're still allowed to burn them together. So because of that, they assume it must be on a doraita level we're talking about. So now they say, chutz mi tful yom. By the way, the only unique case where tumat mashkin doesn't apply is a tful yom. If, let's say, a tful yom comes in contact with a liquid, it's not going to raise up the level any higher than a sheni, because the tful yom was already on his way out of tuma, and the rabbis weren't stringent there, and therefore elashmamina doraita. We must assume that we're talking on a doraita level, and that's why we go back to Rabbi, who said we can infer from Rabbi Akiva that he thinks that for any liquid to basically pass on impurity to food, the fact that it can do that is doraita. Okay, basically he's siding on one side of this machloket. Last part for today. Amar Rabbi Meir, midivreihem lamadu. So now, as I mentioned, when we read the Mishnah, we didn't really understand midivreihem, and we're only going to start this sugya today. Midivrei Rabbi Chanina skana kohanim. If you want to say midivrei Rabbi Chanina skana kohanim. Again, what did he say? Let's go back to the Mishnah. He says from there, which now we understand what there is much better, right? You can mix truma, you can mix items that became impure that basically you're going to raise up the level of tuma. If you mix them with something else, you can still burn them all together. We're not worried about that. So midivreihem lamadnu shesofim truma tahora imat mea bepesach. You can burn truma tahora with truma tamea on Pesach. So if you want to say we learn from Rabbi Chanina skana kohanim midame hatam tameh v'tameh hachatahor v'tameh. His case was burning two impure items together. That's not the same as burning something pure with something impure. So that doesn't work. Ve'ela midivrei Rabbi Akiva. Also, it doesn't work. Hatam pasul v'tameh. There was something that was disqualified, the truma, the oil, with something that was impure. Again, two kind of bad things. And here, hachatahor v'tameh. So here it's impure and pure, and therefore it doesn't make so much sense. So he says, Nema, we're now going to reject, and it's a debate who exactly this is rejecting, but maybe it's rejecting both of the rejections of the fact that we said it can't be Rabbi Akiva, it can't be Rabbi Chanina. Nema kasava Rabbi Meir, maybe he held matnitin ba'ava tuma deoraita, uvlada tuma derabanan. Maybe the ava tuma was deoraita, but the vlada tuma was only derabanan. To me deoraita tahor ma'alya. And then, so now we're going to say that maybe what he was referring to, that what we're discussing here in the Mishnah is that the one piece of meat that we're worried about, that maybe it's coming in contact with this other thing and it's disqualifying it, is actually only that the higher level tumah was the one that was on a Torah level. And this extra piece that we now have that we're going to burn together with it was actually on a Torah level, not tameh at all. And it was only tameh because the rabbis instituted, for whatever reason, it was one of those rabbinic in nature, and it only has a level of impurity on a rabbinic level. And then we're saying, if we can take something that if we look from a pure Torah level, this is actually fine, and the other one is not, and only from a rabbinic level, it's problematic. Then we can compare that together with Rabbi Chanina Skan. We can compare that together with the truma that we're burning with all the chametz that we're burning. Okay, so truma tahora, we can burn truma that's chametz, that's totally fine with disqualified truma, and we don't have to worry about it, just like these cases on a Torah level would be totally fine, and yet because they're rabbinic problematic, right? They're problematic on a rabbinic level, and we're mixing it with something that's really Torah level, and therefore on a Torah level, we're disqualifying it, and we're not worried about that. Therefore, also on Erev Pesach, we're not worried about disqualifying this good truma, and maybe we can learn it from there. Umay mitivrehem, and then what's the mitivrehem? Midivrei Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim. And some people say not only Rabbi Chanina, but also Rabbi Akiva. There's a debate about whether this is derived only from Rabbi Chanina, or could it also be derived from Rabbi Akiva. We'll leave that issue aside. That's just an extra thing. Okay, so I hope that this made some order for you out of the Tum and Tara stuff. And as we go on the next few days, we'll better understand this whole issue of all these different Tumas and Taras. Okay, so hopefully you have a nice Shabbat or Shavua Tov.